All right, we're in the law of property and estates, and I am now going to go over what I have listed as handout 2A, which is property rights, economic control contained in the Constitution. Even though the Constitution was written specifically as a political document to create the structure for the government that was going to tie the 13 independent colonies together, it also had economic and property considerations built into it. Again, as I think I stated in the first lecture, the people who were behind the American Revolution were primarily the merchants, the plantation owners, and the upper classes of the colonies. They very much felt that their lives had been infringed upon by British regulations concerning trade and commerce and by taxation. And they were really the main drivers of the whole impetus to break free from England. They, of course, had great interest in preserving their property rights and preserving their status, and they effectively worked at working with the state governments when they were independent, and then at trying to bring them together in a manner that would, again, protect private property rights and allow business to flourish. One of the major things, two of the major things that prompted the abandonment of the Articles of Confederation and the search for a new, stronger system were the fact that each colony was printing its own money. And printing of money, if you've ever studied economics, it's fraught with all kinds of peril. It causes all kinds of dislocations in economic systems, and particularly where you have a number of currencies being printed and attempted to be utilized at the same time, you run into all kinds of issues as to how secure is a currency, what's the valuation of a dollar issued by Rhode Island versus a dollar issued by Virginia. How do we determine that? So that was creating great problems, plus the fact that states like Rhode Island were happily printing money with nothing to back it, and people in the other states, they were onto that. They realized that a lot of this paper money that was floating around could very easily turn out to have no value whatsoever, to be worthless in the not too distant future. So they wanted to somehow get control of that. And secondly, states had begun setting up tariffs between each other, so that if you grew something or made something in Rhode Island and wanted to bring it to Massachusetts, you had to pay a tax for the privilege of bringing your item into Massachusetts. And the merchants, again, already a system had developed among the colonies where there was a rudimentary road system, there was a well-established shipping system where things grown or made in one colony would be shipped to another colony to be bought and sold. And this whole idea of local regulation and taxation, local determination of what could or could not come into or out of a state, really stood to hamper and negatively affect the business interests of a lot of the merchants and the farmers and the plantation owners. So in writing the Constitution, they not only wanted to establish this government to protect them from outside powers and to bring some kind of unity, but they wanted to nail down some of these economic issues that they found troubling by letting 13 states each handle things their own way. Article 1 of the Constitution sets up the Congress, lays out what the powers and authority of Congress are to be, and this is where we find the vast majority of the different provisions that we would say control property or control the economy. If you go through the Article 1 of the Constitution, the first few sections of it have to do, again, with setting up the government, who's going to be a congressperson, who can be a senator, how do we elect them, how do we choose them. But when we get down to sections 7, 8, 9, and 10, we start getting into the powers and authority of Congress, and this brings us right into economics and property. Section 7 says that all taxes, all revenue bills must originate in the House of Representatives. Now, the idea behind that was The representatives were, in those days, the only part of Congress that were directly elected by the people. The number of representatives was determined by the number of people in your state. There were only 2 senators from each state. And the belief was that representatives would be closer to the people. They could be voted out of office every 2 years. And so that therefore they should be the ones who have the power to control the money, because taxation by definition means we're taking the citizens' money to pay for the cost of running the government. So that right away was given to specifically not just the Congress, but to the House of Representatives. So what that means is the president can offer a budget, the Senate can say we want to have something done, the Supreme Court, the courts can say we need certain things, but all provision to raise money to pay for these things has to originate with the House of Representatives. If it doesn't start there, it doesn't happen. In Section 8, the Constitution lays out a number of specific things that are to be the duties or the rights of Congress, and among the different things, Congress may collect taxes, they can impose duties, imports and excises. Now these are the taxing of goods coming into the country, and for a long time, that was the way the federal government actually raised money to run itself, so that anything that was imported would have a tax on it. They could also raise excise taxes. Now, excise taxes are kind of a funny thing. Today, the most common form of excise tax would be if you own a car, a recent vintage car that you paid a good amount of money for, you have to pay an excise tax to your city or town. They just take the value of the car and say, boom, the car's worth $20,000, you owe us $200 in taxes every year based on that $20,000. So the federal government was allowed to do that, and they did. They put excise taxes on tobacco and whiskey, which caused great issue even as early as George Washington's administration as first president. There was something called the Whiskey Rebellion out in the southern states in Appalachia, where we get the term moonshiners from, because people had been used to taking their excess crops of corn and wheat, turning them into liquor, and now the federal government was saying you had to pay a tax on that, and they were not happy about that. It did say that Congress had to keep all of these uniform throughout the country, so they couldn't impose one tax in Boston and a different tax in Charlestown, South Carolina, or New York City. They had to be uniform. Congress had the right to borrow money, which they certainly in our time do with a vengeance. They have the right to regulate commerce with foreign nations and with the native tribes, all right, and among the several states. Now, this has become a roadway, a highway for Congress to do almost anything in the 21st century, that they have the right to regulate commerce among the states. Certainly they have the right to deal with foreign countries, to, as we've seen with Mr. Trump was trying to renegotiate various trade deals that have been set up by presidents before him with foreign countries, but even between the various states. So a lot of the regulations that we see about how automobiles are made, what pollution controls are going to be on them, how food is going to be processed, the Food and Drug Administration, all of that comes under this idea in Section 8 of Article 1 of the Corporate Constitution, that Congress can control trade and commerce among the several states. They have the right to coin money, to set the value of, and to set weights and measures. All right, so basically the printing of money, the making of coins is something that is controlled by Congress. Now, in terms of the issuing of paper money and digital money, they have turned that over to the Federal Reserve System, which is a whole nother story that we'll get into a little bit when we talk about financing and banking. But it ultimately comes down to Congress. They can punish counterfeiters. They can establish post offices and roads. Now, this doesn't seem like a property reality, but it is a very important economic reality. From the very beginning, the Congress realized the importance of being able to communicate easily and to move goods and services freely among the various colonies. When George Washington was elected president the first time, he was living at Mount Vernon in Northern Virginia, just outside of what is today Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. did not exist The first capital was in New York City. And so in order to be sworn in by as president, Washington had to travel to New York. It took 6 weeks for him to go from Northern Virginia up what it would now be the Jersey Turnpike to get to New York City. So there was a desperate need to improve transportation. And coming down to our own time, we have the post office system that exists that handles snail mail and all kinds of packages and stuff. We have the interstate highway system to provide transportation routes between the various states and the major cities within the states. Congress, for a limited time, could give exclusive rights to copyrights, trademarks, and patents. A very important reality. Once you have a trademark, once you have a patent, once you have a copyright, what has happened there is property has been created. You now have property rights. The big yellow M is owned by McDonald's. No other restaurant, I dare say no other corporation, dare uses a yellow M as its logo because that is owned by McDonald's. Many McDonald's restaurants are what are called franchises. They're owned by local people who contract with McDonald's Corporation to use McDonald's goods and services and methods of cooking in that. And one of the things they contract with is the right to use the yellow M because of the great advertising power that it has. So right here, we're basically in the Constitution giving the Congress the right to create property rights, and to allow those to exist for a certain period of time. Bankruptcy was to be controlled solely by Congress. And today, how that operates is Congress is given the authority to handle bankruptcy to the federal district courts. Now, this is important because bankruptcy is a way to wipe out your debts. Many people, as they're trying to build businesses, buy property, sell property, they get themselves into trouble, they get into debts that can't be paid. In colonial times, there was only one way to get out of that. You were put in jail until you could pay your debts back. Now, that's kind of a ridiculous idea because if you're in jail, how do you earn money? But the hope was that your rich great aunt or your grandmother or somebody would feel bad for you, pay off your debt, and get you out of jail. The states had begun to try and create different ways to handle debtors short of prison, but it was not uniform. And of course, if we are freeing debtors from their debts, we are wiping out other people's property, because debt means that somebody owes money to someone else. If we wipe out the debt, we're also wiping out the property of the person that debt is owed to. And again, looking at 13 different states, the people who wrote the Constitution felt that Rhode Island would give preference to Rhode Islanders and not to people from other states in handling bankruptcy or handling creditors' rights. So therefore, right from the get-go, they put this into the federal system. It's controlled by the federal courts, and regardless of what state or city you're from, it all has to be handled equally. Section 9, again, deals with basically some things that Congress can't do. No direct taxes. So there could be no taxes on a person. There could be taxes on property. There could be taxes on imports, but no taxes on a person. This was changed in 1913 by the 16th Amendment, which for the first time allowed the creation of an income tax that would apply directly to individuals. Now, there had been an income tax established during the Civil War, but it only lasted for a couple of years, and it ended with the end of the war, and nobody really got the chance to challenge that in the courts. But as we were approaching entry into World War I, and the Congress needed money to arm the country and to build up the military, they were able to amend the Constitution, and they were, from there on, ever after allowed to tax us as individuals. And today, you know, they take out Social Security taxes, they take out Medicare taxes, they take out your income taxes directly from your paycheck before you even get to see it. They've imposed the rules and the laws on the employers to make sure that this money gets siphoned off and sent to Washington. And of course, the states, not being stupid, quickly amended their constitutions or enacted laws to allow themselves to collect income taxes as well, to raise money. And I would venture to say that today, by and large, the largest amount of money raised by the federal government is through direct income taxes of individuals and of corporations. They could not impose tariffs on anything shipped from state to state. They could not give preference over one port to another. So they could not say that all goods and services that go through customs have to come through New York City and nowhere else. They have to equally portion that out among the states. No money could be taken from the Treasury until Congress appropriated, voted on it, and then only when there was an accounting of the money that was spent. No, going into Section 10, no state was any longer allowed to coin money or to print up paper money. And interesting, no state could require that anything be tender for a payment of debts beyond gold or silver. Those of you who study economics will know there's a tremendous fight over what is reality. Is paper money real or not real, or are gold and silver actually metals the only real money? And this fight between these two concepts was already going on 200 years ago when the Constitution was being written, and they kind of gave a preference to gold and silver today. However, what has happened is the issuance of the dollar, the paper dollar, has been seen as being so secure that that has become acceptable for all debts, for all payments at this point in time. And the states no longer require you to pay in gold or silver. They will accept the paper money issued through the Federal Reserve on behalf of the federal government. Most important, Section 10 says there'll be no state may impair the obligation of contracts. A contract is an agreement between two private parties for the exchange of goods or services, for money or for other goods or services, and contracts create property rights. As a matter of fact, a large part of the property rights that we deal with today are contractual rights. And what they're saying here, and in England, this is still very much controlled by Parliament or the Crown. If a company got very prosperous, they would kind of stick their nose in and make sure that somehow the government was involved in seeing that they got their share of things. And here, right from the get-go, they did not want that interference from the government to exist in the new country, and they forbade the states from interfering with private contracts. And again, no state could impose tariffs or custom duties. In the amendments, not a lot of stuff about the economy or about property. The Third Amendment says no quartering or no billeting of soldiers, so they couldn't take your property without compensation for you to support troops or support the military. Fifth Amendment does say there's no taking of property without due process of law. It goes on to say no condemnation, no taking of property for use by the government without compensation. 14th Amendment echoes the Fifth Amendment and applies it to the states, saying that no state may deprive a person of life, liberty, or property without due process. And the 16th Amendment, as we said, created the power of Congress to impose income taxes on individuals. And that's about it. The rest of the amendments to the Constitution really don't speak to property matters. So there's a quick thumbnail run-through of the different property and economic issues that are contained in the Constitution. When I teach constitutional law, I certainly cover the aspect of it of setting up the government. How do we know that we elect a president every 4 years? What's the electoral college? How do you get to be a senator? Who can be a congressperson? What are their duties? What are their rights? We cover all that. I certainly go over the Bill of Rights and the individual protections and liberties that we have, but I also try to emphasize the fact that the Constitution is part and parcel along with setting up the government and giving us certain rights. It is an economic document. It basically states certain rules and regulations and presumptions about how the economic system is going to operate and what the government can or cannot do in terms of controlling that or interfering with private individuals. Very different from certainly a communist system where the government is in control of all economic activity and all property rights, or a socialistic system where it's kind of a mishmash between private rights and governmentally controlled rights. They did not call it capitalism. That's not the word that they would have applied in those days 200 years ago. But our Constitution greatly favors property rights as they had developed and were understood under English law as being available even against the government, that the private individual has rights against the government, and that the private individual has rights to engage in commerce and trade without the government preventing that or severely interfering in that. And these are basically, whether the Constitution doesn't use that word, but these are basically capitalistic values, capitalistic ideals, which means that although at this point in time, there are so many things going on, the federal government has so much control that things are very mucked up in terms of, are we capitalistic, are we socialistic, what's the real system we have? It's kind of a hodgepodge at this point. The basic bones of it was basically calling for a capitalistic system. You hear a lot of talk now about changing that, and certainly certain members of Congress, even certain people who ran for the presidency this year, are looking to absolutely change that and to move us more towards a more socialistic type of system. It will be up to you young folks to decide as we go forward. All right, over and out for that handout. We will be moving on next to the handout that I call handout 3, that gets us into some basic legal ideas about property and property rights.